in this lecture we will primarily focus on the growth and development of Mexican national cinema, or the New Wave movement as it's known in Mexico. The study of national cinema, as you will realize throughout the course of this lecture, however, requires tracing its predecessors to a certain degree. As early as 1902, cinema became a medium in Mexico of marking the movement from the pre-modern to the modern. While this change was portrayed very powerfully in visual terms, in terms of large-scale industrialization and its attendant oppressions, it also showed the destruction of the agricultural way of life, and as well as the erosion of customs and practices considered to be eternal and even sacred. The early filmic melodramas, as you may be aware, reflected the themes and values of the serial novels. The melodrama is associated with the rise of the middle class and also the transition from the space of the rural to the space of the urban. So thereby, in the space of the city, we see the barrio being showcased as a repository of traditional values and age-old customs, while the city is shown to be embodied in terms of newer social structures that are threatening to the barrio in terms of being the seat of immorality, disease, sensuality, death, destruction, and even vice. So the journey of the woman from the space of the rural to the space of the urban shows the potential of the city to corrupt and infect, to destroy innocence and lead to perhaps a damning experience. Now the melodramatic form, you must remember, began dominating Mexican cinema from the second decade of the 19th century. The early 20th century saw the almost complete domination of Hollywood cinema in Mexico. You must be aware that the First World War caused mass-scale destruction in Europe, with the result that production houses in leading centers of production like France and Germany faced massive losses. So as a result, these seats of production, which were considered to be avant-garde centers of film production, were closed completely. As a result, Hollywood cinema began to monopolize world markets, and this happened particularly in Latin America and especially in Mexico. As a result, Hollywood began dominating circuits and agents of distribution in countries such as Mexico. The national cinema, which had begun in terms of the filmic melodramas, also thereby began to ebb and wane. Hollywood's popularity spread thanks to the resonant images of modernity it provided to the Mexican audiences, and also the technical finesse which Hollywood cinema was able to provide to cinema goers. Hollywood provided a larger-than-life package and was deemed to be captivating and highly lucrative in drawing audiences. In these films, you must remember, Hollywood often found in Mexico the exotic other, adventurous bandits, noble savages, and beautiful senoritas. In both documentaries as well as fictional films, Mexico appears both as desire as well as threat for Hollywood cinema. The exotic other became a site of both fascination as well as revulsion for Hollywood. Now you must remember the events of the US-Mexico War, which date back to the 1840s and 50s. Mexico lost large sections of its territory to the USA, and as a result, Mexico's border shrunk southwards. So states like Texas, New Mexico, Atlanta, and Georgia, which were formerly part of Mexico, now became portions of US territory. A significant number of Hispanic people also found themselves counted as US citizens and were divorced from their home country, Mexico, both politically, culturally, as well as linguistically. They became the homegrown aliens or other for the dominant white population in popular discourse and culture. At this stage, we must talk about the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution marked an important intervention on the part of cinema in documenting a change in Mexican political, social, and cultural life that created a massive paradigm shift. Cinema contributed very significantly to creating visual constructions of the Mexican Revolution in popular consciousness and culture. A small note about the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution, you must remember, students, was begun with the goal of leveling differences between two factions in the country, between two very disparate groups in the country, the land-owning elite gentry and the landless peasants and laborers. According to the Latin American historian Eduardo Galeano, prior to the revolution, more than 97% of the land in Mexico was owned by less than 3% of the population. The landless laborers and peasants, as well as the indigenous people in Mexico, were exploited quite mercilessly and given very, very inadequate recompensation for their labor. Now, the cinema of Mexico, in terms of the narrative it structures around the revolution, basically revolves around the widespread mass uprising which began against the dictator Porfirio Diaz in 1910. The cinema also traces the prolonged struggle for power that involved various political and military forces which rallied around important figures such as Francisco Madero. The cinematic narrative, you will also realize, figures people such as legendary heroes who include Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, and Madero as well. The focus, however, students, you must remember, is less on the many anonymous Mexican peasants, workers, and indigenous people who participated in the movement, which did begin, after all, in the true spirit of a people's uprising, at least initially. The cinema depicts mass mobilizations and popular insurrections, as well as anti-insurgency and pacification operations which were launched by the government and revolutionary forces. Peace treaties were solemnized for umpteenth number of times but never enforced. The revolutionary ideals and principles of the Mexican Revolution were obstructed by the opposing agendas of a peasantry who were fighting for their rights for the land and the middle class as well as the land-owning gentry. Now, the middle class, you must realize, insisted on retaining an electoral structure that would privilege or enhance their interests, while the land-owning gentry believed in retaining past privileges which had been secured at the expense of the peasantry and the larger working class. We must concentrate on the social realities of the Mexican Revolution, which include the facts that the battles led to the loss of as many as 1 million lives in a population as large as 15 million. There was tremendous insecurity and lawlessness in the rural areas, which led to the creation of the figure of the cacique, or the rural dictator, come landlord, who practiced unprecedented oppression. The figure of the cacique continued to be perpetuated much after the revolution was said to have experienced a closure. The failure of the revolution, you must realize, was therefore due to the conflicting interests of the two groups we mentioned a minute ago. The land-owning gentry and the middle class on the one hand, and the landless peasantry, indigenous peoples and laborers on the other. The failure of the revolution led to mass-scale disillusionment, despair, and hopelessness among the underprivileged sections of Mexican society who had invested much hope in the revolution. The cinema perhaps has not been as faithful or as incisive or insightful, rather, in documenting the attendant disillusionment which came with the failure of the revolution. The failure of the revolution is critically analyzed in a novel like Pedro Páramo, for instance. You may have read the novel. It's by the very popular Mexican novelist Juan Rulfo. Coming to films on the revolution again, Films on the revolution began to decline after the 1920s, both in terms of Mexican productions as well as those of Hollywood. It was feared that the country would be portrayed in a negative light, and so filmic depictions shifted to mythic and symbolic as well as sanitized renderings of the revolution without highlighting the actual ground realities which took place, the attendant disillusionment, the contradictions, and the mass crisis faced by the country. Now, we can't, however, say that critical films on the revolution were not being made at all. At this stage, we must mention Sergei Eisenstein, the legendary Soviet filmmaker, who made the incomplete film Que Viva Mexico. And also mention must be made of the very important Mexican director Fernando de Fuentes, who made a couple of films which offered a bleak and sober vision of the Mexican Revolution, pretty much in the vein of Juan Rulfo's Pedro Páramo. Now, these few films had a critical take on the revolution, but most films of the time tended to represent the revolution as a spectacular folkloric show. Coming to Fernando de Fuentes again, his most successful film was Out on the Big Ranch, which was released in 1936. Fuentes created this genre of an idyllic Mexican pastoral, which became a very popular form in the cinema which was produced subsequently. His films revolved around the figures of the singing charro, or the Mexican countryside singer. He used Mexican cultural forms like the canción ranchera from Guadalajara, which, as you know, is a region in Mexico, and the bajío. His films were replete with beautiful señoritas, charros, and also a vision of paternalistic feudalism, where there were castes of honest landowners and diligent workers, harking back to a time prior to the revolution, quite interestingly. A certain level of rural idealization, a certain idyllic rendering of the rural space was thereby practiced, as you may gather. On a parallel level, the urban idealization was also taking place in films on the urban space. Now we come to what was known as the golden age of Mexican cinema, and the most important figure of this time was the filmmaker Emilio Fernandez, who in his films combined both patriotism and star power. Emilio Fernandez revived the genre of the film on the Mexican Revolution, but critics, you will note, students, interestingly, are divided on his place in the cinema of Mexico. Some say that he reverted to picturesque stereotypes and blindly mimicked as well as quite naively portrayed the situation of the revolution according to North American and European models. But other critics say that he manages to portray the space of Mexico as a primal atavistic space, which would subsequently lead to the fomentation of a new nation with an infinitely new and radical national character and sensibility. The cinema, you will also note, at this time was revived, but yet it was viewed with suspicion by nationalists like Jose Vasconcelos, the visionary education minister of the government, who sought to define a cultural project for Mexico and looked for emblems of post-revolutionary optimism. Figures like Vasconcelos remained bitterly antagonized by the cinema, as they saw in the cinema the devil of the North. You will realize the enemy across the border, the United States, of course. After the revolution, we need to discuss a very important theme in Mexican cinema, and that is the struggles and difficulties faced by Mexican Americans when they crossed the border into the USA for employment opportunities. By the late 1940s, the border towns such as Ciudad Juarez, you may have heard of it, had become a center of several rackets and organized crime. Mass migrations, both legal as well as illegal, were rampant across the border from Mexico to the USA, and Americanization of Mexican culture was becoming an integral part of Mexican urban consciousness. At this stage, we need to think of the films of the comedian Germán Valdés, or Tintan as he was known. His films include The King of the Barrio, The Rebel, and these were highly popular. Tintan is seen to essay the character of a Mexican-American Pachuco, a zoot-suited, upwardly mobile figure who can talk and dance his way out of tricky situations related to border crossings in a mixture of Spanglish idioms and border music rhythms. Another important director of this time is Luis Buñuel. Luis Buñuel made 20-odd films in Mexico between 1946 and 65, and you may be aware that he was part of the surrealistic movement. Buñuel was an important surrealist, and he disagreed with the orthodoxies of neorealism, seeking not to render things as they appear, but rather to interpret reality in terms of the way it is perceived. Buñuel argued in his films that reality depends on the subjective perception of the viewer and cannot be processed or interpreted objectively. At the time his films were released, Buñuel's films did not meet with a very warm response. The response can be called lukewarm at best. But subsequently, critics and cineasts of Mexican cinema have hailed him to be a major inspiration. We come to the 1960s in Mexico from Buñuel, and through the 1960s and 80s, you will interestingly note that state power played a major role in diffusing radicalism in the arts, and so cinema was no exception. The film industry was jealously guarded by vested interests, and change in the aspect of cinema was not really noteworthy. Cinema was not allowed to be invested with social or political concerns, let alone express itself radically. At this time, however, a beacon of light appeared in the form of the Nuevo Cine group. Now, the Nuevo Cine group consisted of cineasts like José de la Colina, Rafael Cordici, Salvador Elizondo, and Jomi M. Garcia Ascot, as well as Paul Leduc. Paul Leduc, we should note, for his film made in 1983, Frida Naturaleza Viva, on the life of the very important Mexican surrealist painter Frida Kahlo, and the relationship she shared with her husband Diego Rivera. Now, Elizondo and others in the group called Nueva Cine strongly attacked the policy of protectionism, a tired genre, and the fading star system. An incentive to revive cinema also came from the film union STPC, which organized an experimental film competition in the years 1964 to 65. The prize was won, please note, by Ruben Gamez's La Fórmula Secreta, or The Secret Formula, and Alberto Isaac's En este pueblo no hay ladrones, or In this town there are no thieves. This, interestingly, was the first major film adaptation of a work by the Nobel Prize winning Colombian novelist Garcia Marquez. In the 1970s, the Echeverría administration attempted to do away with the previous tyrannical measures imposed by the previous government, and Mexicans found themselves in a space where they were free to criticize, express themselves, and organize publicly. President Echeverría played an instrumental role in reviving radicalism in cinema. He facilitated the reform of the Banco Cinematográfico. He founded the Mexican Cinematheque. He established a film school, the CCC, or the Centro de Capacitación Cinematográfica, and gradually increased the role of the state in production and distribution. The major studios, which included America, were turned over to state cinema, and the premier theaters were required to screen Mexican cinema exclusively. A new generation of filmmakers founded possible thus to express themselves. Among this generation, we must take note of Arturo Ripstein. He was noted for films such as El Castillo de la Pureza, The Castle of Purity, released in 1973, and El Lugar Sin Límites, or Hell Without Limits, which found release in 1978. I want to discuss the latter film, Hell Without Limits, in a little detail. This film exposes the intolerance and inherent brutality of machismo in Mexican society. Manuelita, the owner of a brothel in a small town, is gay and cross-dresses, and he entertains as a flamenco dancer. The rich and elderly Don Alejo, a cacique figure to whom most of the town is indebted, wishes to sell the town for profit, and the sale of the brothel will seal the deal. Pancho is a hot-headed young man who owes Don Alejo money and is seen to be the embodiment of frustrated machismo. He is unable to achieve anything, and Pancho and his brother-in-law together kill Manuelita. Queerness is noted to be aberrant and taboo. Homophobia and hatred of the sexual other leads to a bleak and sober conclusion, imbuing the character of Manuelita with tragedy and pathos.
Esa Manuela, te tiraste al más guapo.
Yo siempre soy así, siempre triunfe y triunfe.
Es que veo esa de verdad.
¿Y tú por qué no bailas, baba de perico? Debías de aprender un poco de tu madre. Déjala en paz. ¿Qué más quieres que echarte a su mamá? Tú sí jalas conmigo, ¿verdad, Cloti?
Sí, yo siempre he sido muy buena bailarina.
Sí, pero aquí la triunfadora de la noche soy yo, Chulita. ¿Verdad, corazón? Eso ni se discute, mi reina. Un hombre tiene que ser capaz de probar de todo, ¿no cree? Pues cuando usted disponga.
Dale, cuñado. No sea maricón usted también.
Yo quise.
No te hagas. Te vi que lo estabas besuqueando.
¿Cómo que, cuñado? ¿Cómo me voy a dejar besar por este pinche puto? ¿Usted está loco, cuñado? ¿Cómo cree que me voy a dejar hacer eso? A ver tú, ¿tampoco me besaste?
Ya estuvo, Pancho. Vente, échate otro trago.
Tú, puto, contéstame. Era pura broma. Una cosa es andar de farra y otra que me vengas a besar la cara.
Caray.
¡Ya no joda!
¡Pancho!
Ole los besos buenos.
Súbete al camión para alcanzarlo. ¡Órale! ¡Agárrala, cuñado! ¡Vas a ver!
¡No! ¡No, Pancho! ¡No! ¡No, Pancho!
¡Agárramelo ahí! ¡Cuñado!
¡Pancho!
This context of machismo, which we just talked about, leads to the creation of grounds for sexual violence on a large scale in Latin American culture and society. And we noted an example in the film Hell Without Limits, where Manuelita, the gay cross-dressing flamenco dancer, ultimately dies because of the virulent and aggressive nature of machismo.
No es posible.
Si quiere, disparo.
No, espérate.
Está muerto.
Se está haciendo la muerta.
Carajo, Pancho. Vámonos antes de que nos vean. Pícale.
Recent directors of note who have won acclaim include Alejandro González Iñárritu. González Iñárritu is not strictly concerned with national cinema, as we discussed earlier, but is inclined towards a transnational approach in his work, as is seen in films such as Babel. You may be familiar with Babel, it's a popular film. Issues related to Mexico figure prominently in his films, and they are seen to be interwoven with matters topical to the current global scenario. The body of work of González Iñárritu includes Amor